There's a moment, a single, quiet, unremarkable moment, that most people never see coming. It doesn't arrive with alarms or flashing lights. It doesn't announce itself in the language of catastrophe. It arrives wearing ordinary clothes, hidden behind the face of a perfectly reasonable decision, a purchase that felt justified, an investment that felt safe, a choice that felt like yours. And in that moment, in that one invisible turning point, everything you thought you understood about money quietly, irreversibly collapses. Not because a market crashed, not because someone stole from you, not because the economy shifted or the numbers stopped adding up, but because somewhere deep inside the architecture of your own mind, wired in long before you ever earned your first dollar, a fundamental misunderstanding was living, patient, invisible, waiting. And tonight, we are going to trace that misunderstanding all the way back to where it lives. Because the real truth about money, the truth that Morgan Housel spent years uncovering, is not hiding in a trading algorithm or a tax strategy or a set of economic models built by people with degrees you'll never earn. It is hiding somewhere far more intimate than that. It is hiding inside you. Inside the emotions you don't like to admit you have. Inside the fears you've learned to disguise as logic. Inside the childhood memories you stopped thinking about decades ago, but that are still, right now, quietly shaping every financial decision you believe you're making freely. Housel watched brilliant people go broke. He watched people with average incomes quietly, almost invisibly, build extraordinary wealth over decades. He watched geniuses destroy their portfolios with perfect, rational-sounding reasoning. And he watched ordinary, unremarkable people with ordinary paychecks do something that almost no financial theory could explain. They just kept going. Quietly, patiently, without drama. And over time, the gap between them and everyone else became staggering. The difference between those two groups was not intelligence. It was not access. It was not luck alone. It was behavior. It was the stories they told themselves. It was what they did, not just when things were going well, but in the moments of genuine terror, when every instinct they had was screaming at them to stop. This is the psychology of money, and it starts with a question that sounds almost insultingly simple, but that will haunt you before this is over. Are you making your own financial decisions? Or is something else, something older, something deeper, something you've never directly examined, making them for you? Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last 5 years of your financial life. Every decision you made about money, every time you spent freely, every time you pulled back, every investment you made or considered making, every moment you felt that particular cocktail of excitement and terror that accompanies a big financial risk. You believe, genuinely, sincerely believe, that those decisions came from deliberate thought, from research, from wisdom accumulated through experience and careful observation. But here is the part that unsettles everything. Housel discovered that the foundation of almost every financial decision most people make isn't reasoning at all. It's memory. More specifically, it's the emotional residue of every financial experience you had before you were old enough to understand what was really happening. Before you understood what a mortgage was, you understood the feeling in your house when one couldn't be paid, Before you knew what investment risk meant, you understood, in your body, in your nervous system, what it looked like when a trusted adult lost money. Before anyone ever explained inflation to you, you absorbed something about scarcity and abundance from the dinner table conversations that stopped abruptly when children walked in. And all of those experiences, all of that wordless emotional data, became the operating system beneath your financial decision-making. The terrifying implication is that you have been running on code you didn't write and have never reviewed. Housel makes an observation that lands with the force of a quiet accusation. He says each of us experiences only a tiny, narrow slice of the actual financial world. And yet we make decisions as though our personal slice represents universal truth. Consider this. In America, people from lower income backgrounds spend a meaningful portion of their limited earnings on lottery tickets, a fact that consistently baffles and frustrates people with higher incomes. To the wealthy observer, it looks like stupidity, like self-destruction in slow motion. But look at it from inside the experience of someone who has no realistic, conventional path to wealth. No family connections, no investment capital, no safety net, no generational momentum pointing upward. In that context, a lottery ticket is not a financial instrument. It is the only available dream. It is the only door in a corridor of walls. Neither judgment is irrational. Both are perfectly rational responses to completely different experiences of the same world. The problem, the deep, persistent problem, is that most people never recognize their experience as a perspective. They mistake it for truth, and they spend their entire financial lives defending the decisions of a person they were formed into long before they had any choice in the matter. But here's what changes when you finally see this clearly. When you understand that your instincts about money were built, not born, that they can be examined, questioned, and gradually reshaped, you gain access to a kind of freedom most people never find. Not because you become rational in some cold, robotic sense, but because for the first time, the decisions start to feel like yours. And now the story gets genuinely strange. Because Housel doesn't just say your emotions influence your financial choices. He says the universe itself has a vote in your financial story. And that vote can, and regularly does, override everything else. Your discipline, your intelligence, your impeccably constructed 5-year plan. He tells us about Bill Gates, and most people think they know that story. Brilliant kid, saw the future, built an empire through vision and hard work. And all of that is true. But the full story is something more uncanny than that. Gates attended Lakeside School in Seattle, a private school that, in 1968, had a computer terminal. Not a lab, not a course, a single terminal. At a time when most universities in the entire country didn't have access to one. The odds of a 13-year-old kid encountering that specific technology at that specific moment in the history of computing, when everything was still being figured out, when the entire architecture of a future industry was still wet clay, were almost incalculably small. It required a specific school, in a specific city, attended by a specific family that could afford the tuition, made possible by a single teacher who spent roughly $3,000 of the school's budget on a machine most educators didn't understand yet. Remove any one of those variables, and the story ends before it begins. But it gets more haunting than that. At that same school, in those same years, there were three exceptionally gifted students with an obsession for computing: Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and a third boy named Kent Evans, brilliant, driven, deeply talented, by all accounts the equal of either of his two friends. Kent Evans never got to show the world what he might have built. He died in a mountaineering accident before he graduated. Same school, same computer, same fire. But only two lives continued forward. Housel isn't telling this story to depress you. He's telling it because it reveals something that our entire culture of financial success refuses to acknowledge: that luck and risk are not just minor footnotes in the story of success and failure. They are sometimes the entire story. The same force that gives one person an extraordinary advantage, being born at the right time, in the right place, to parents who could afford the right school, is the same force that takes everything from someone else in an afternoon. And we live in a society that celebrates the winners as though they were solely responsible for winning, and judges the losers as though they were solely responsible for losing. But what if the most important variable in some of the greatest success stories in human history was never about the person at all? What if it was about a school, a teacher, a budget decision made in 1968 by someone whose name almost no one remembers? There's a story Housel tells that sounds, on the surface, like the setup to a joke. Two famous writers at a party thrown by a hedge fund billionaire. The rooms are soaked in the kind of wealth that doesn't just communicate success. It communicates a different relationship with reality altogether. And Kurt Vonnegut, surveying the spectacle, leans toward his friend Joseph Heller and says something gently devastating. He points out that their host made more money in a single day than Heller's most celebrated novel had earned across its entire existence. Heller's most celebrated novel, the one that defined a generation, the one that put a new phrase into the English language, the one that will be read long after both men and their host are forgotten. And Heller smiles, the kind of smile that carries something Vonnegut wasn't expecting. "Yes," Heller says, "but I have something he will never have." And the silence that follows is the real story. Enough. That single word, hanging in the air of a billionaire's party, is the kind of sentence that doesn't make noise when it lands. It makes weight. And it raises a question that Housel says is one of the most difficult and most important questions in all of personal finance. How much is actually enough for you? Not enough to feel comfortable. Not enough to stop worrying. Not enough by the standards of whoever you're currently measuring yourself against. Enough in the deepest sense, the Heller sense, where you genuinely know in your bones that what you have is sufficient and that risking it for more would be a trade you don't want to make. Because here is what capitalism does that nobody puts on the brochure. It builds an engine of ambition so efficient, so relentless, so beautifully designed, that it also manufactures envy as a necessary byproduct. The same system that rewards you for earning more ensures there is always, without exception, someone ahead of you. Always a larger number. Always a more impressive portfolio. Always a life that looks from the outside like the one you should have been building. And so the goalpost moves. It moves when you get the raise. It moves when you hit the savings number you wrote down 3 years ago. It moves when you look at your phone at midnight and see what someone else's Tuesday looked like. And the people who never find enough, the ones who are always reaching, always stretching, always willing to risk the things that cannot be replaced in order to acquire the things that keep multiplying. Those are the people Housel watches with a kind of quiet, clinical concern that feels almost like sorrow. Because some of the things they put on the table in that endless game are not recoverable. Their integrity, their health, their sleep, their relationships, their sense of self, their freedom. And once those things are gone, no balance in any account, no matter how large, can bring them back. Heller understood something that most people only understand. In retrospect, usually at enormous cost. The point of the game is not to win more. The point is to decide when you've already won. And most people never stop long enough to make that decision. Then there's Warren Buffett. And every time his name comes up in a conversation about money, people reach for the usual explanations. Genius, vision, discipline, an almost supernatural ability to see value where others see noise. All of that is real. But Husserl looked at the Buffett story from an angle that almost no one uses. And what he found there was so disarmingly simple that it felt at first like it couldn't possibly be the real answer. Buffett didn't just start investing young. He started investing at 10 years old, and he never stopped. Not during wars, not during recessions, not during the chaotic, terrifying years when markets did things that made seasoned professionals exit in panic. He just kept going. Housel ran the numbers and found something that should permanently change the way you think about wealth. If Warren Buffett had started investing at the typical age of 30, a perfectly reasonable, still early by most standards age, and had retired at 65 with the same annual return rate he actually achieved, his net worth today would be somewhere around $11 or $12 million. Not 100 billion, not even close. 11 million. Comfortable, secure, admirable, but not legendary, not historic, not the name that gets invoked in every conversation about investment genius. The difference between 11 million and over $100 billion is not explained by stock-picking skill. It is not explained by access to information or an extraordinary read on market cycles. It is explained almost entirely by time, by compounding, by the mathematical phenomenon that starts slowly, almost invisibly, and then accelerates into something that looks, from the outside, like magic but is actually just arithmetic operating over a long enough period. Here is what that means for you, sitting wherever you are right now. The most powerful financial force available to any ordinary human being is not a sophisticated investment strategy. It is not a brilliant insight. It is not even a high income. It is time plus consistency. It is starting and not stopping. Not stopping when the market drops. Not stopping when the world feels unstable. Not stopping when something shinier appears in your peripheral vision and whispers that you should rearrange everything and start over. The secret, the simple, almost embarrassingly accessible secret, is that you don't need extraordinary returns. You need adequate returns sustained for an extraordinary length of time. And somehow, even knowing this, almost everyone finds a reason to stop. Now slow down, because this next part contains a distinction that, once you see it, will permanently alter how you look at wealth. both in others and in yourself. Morgan Housel draws a line between two things the world has been treating as synonymous for as long as money has existed. He separates being rich from being wealthy, and the difference is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of kind. Think about the people around you, or the carefully curated ones you encounter online, who move through the world in a way that announces their financial status like a fanfare. The cars, the addresses, the vacations photographed in the right light, the clothes that signal access, the restaurant choices that communicate arrival. These people are rich in the way Housel means it. They have significant income, and they spend it, visibly, publicly, in ways specifically designed to communicate a message about their value to the world. And there is a deeply human logic to that display. There's something that feels like success about it, something that registers in other people's eyes in a way that is immediately satisfying. But here is the thing about that display. Every dollar directed toward the performance of wealth is a dollar that was not allowed to compound, was not allowed to grow quietly and invisibly into the kind of financial foundation that actually changes what your life can be. The person with the expensive car may genuinely have a high income, but wealth, true wealth, the kind Housel cares about, is what that person chose not to buy. It is the investment account that has no one to impress. It is the fund that doesn't photograph well. It is the decision, made again and again over years, to preserve capital instead of display it. Real wealth, Housel says, is invisible by definition. It is the car you didn't buy, the kitchen renovation you postponed, the upgrade you declined, the money sitting in accounts that generate no envy because they generate no visibility. And what does all that invisible wealth actually purchase? Not things, not status, not the particular pleasure of being seen as successful. It purchases freedom. The freedom to wake up on a Monday morning and make choices based entirely on what you want, not what you owe. The freedom to say no to an opportunity that pays well but costs you something more important. The freedom to absorb a financial shock without it reshaping every other dimension of your life. Most people spend their entire lives trying to look like they have that freedom. The truly wealthy spend their lives quietly, unglamorously, almost invisibly, making sure they actually have it. Here's where Housel gets personal in a way that's worth paying close attention to, because what he's about to say about savings is not what you've been told before. This is not the advice about emergency funds and retirement accounts that gets repeated in every personal finance article you've ever glazed over. This is something different, something more fundamental. Savings, he argues, is not primarily about preparing for a specific goal. It's not about the down payment or the retirement number or the college fund. Its deepest value, the value that most financial advice never even mentions, is the flexibility it creates, the options it preserves, the choices it keeps alive that would otherwise die. When you have savings, a job loss is a disruption. Without savings, a job loss is a disaster, the kind of cascading, destabilizing disaster that restructures your life in ways you spend years recovering from. When you have savings, a health crisis is devastating but survivable without surrendering your financial future. Without savings, a health crisis becomes a debt sentence that follows you for decades, that limits every subsequent choice, that quietly forecloses whole categories of life that might have been yours. When you have savings, you can take the lower-paying job you actually love. You can start the business that might fail. You can say no to the client who is making your life miserable. Without savings, you are permanently at the mercy of whoever is willing to pay you. And the price of that dependency is measured not in dollars, but in years. And this is the part that most people get wrong. They assume that the ability to save is a function of income. That once they earn more, saving will become natural and easy. But Housel quietly, almost gently, dismantles that assumption. He points out that savings is not primarily about income. It's about the gap between income and ego, between what you earn and what you feel compelled to perform with your earnings. Some of the most financially secure people in history had ordinary incomes and extraordinary discipline. Some of the most financially precarious people alive today earn extraordinary incomes and have zero cushion because every dollar earned is immediately converted into evidence of their worth. The size of the gap between what you earn and what you spend, that is the only number that actually matters in the long run, and the gap can be widened from either direction. You can earn more, or you can want less, and only one of those is fully within your control. Here's something that sounds like it should be obvious, but hits most investors like a revelation when they finally absorb it. Everything valuable in the financial world comes with a price of admission. Not a monetary price, a psychological one. When you invest in markets over a long period of time, you are going to experience periods of genuine terror. Moments when your portfolio loses 30% of its value in what feels like overnight. Months when every credible-sounding voice you follow seems to be saying that this time is different, that recovery is not coming, that you have fundamentally misjudged the situation. Your instincts, ancient, evolutionary, perfectly calibrated for the kinds of threats humans faced 10,000 years ago, will interpret that fear as a signal to act, to do something, to get out, to stop the bleeding before it gets worse. And here is the cruel paradox at the heart of long-term investing. The instinct to act in those moments is almost always the exact wrong response. The investors who built the most extraordinary wealth over long periods of time were not the ones who felt no fear. They were the ones who understood that the fear itself was the price of admission. That volatility is not a bug in the system. It is the system. It is the mechanism by which the market extracts payment for the returns it eventually delivers. Housel uses an analogy that makes this viscerally clear. He says treating market volatility like a fine is different from treating it like a fee. If you get a parking fine, you feel wronged. You try to avoid it next time. You maybe even dispute it. It feels unjust. But if you buy a concert ticket, you pay the fee willingly because you understand that the fee is the price of the experience you're about to have. The investors who survive and thrive are the ones who have consciously reframed the psychological cost of staying invested, not as punishment for being wrong, but as the ticket price for being right over time. And separately, Housel observes something about optimism and pessimism that should make you feel slightly suspicious of your own intellectual instincts. Pessimism sounds smart. When someone predicts disaster, we lean in, we nod, we share the article. We feel somehow that the pessimist is seeing something the optimists are missing. But optimism, steady, evidence-based, historically supported optimism about human economic progress gets treated as naive. And yet the record of history suggests that the optimists, measured over decades, have been right far more often than the pessimists. Progress is quiet and invisible and cumulative. Collapse is loud and immediate and memorable. Our brains, wired for survival, weight them unequally, and that asymmetry costs people money every single year. Now we reach the chapter that people tend to revisit, not because it's the most dramatic, not because it contains the most surprising statistics, but because of what it asks you to look at in yourself. Housel talks about the fact that you are going to change. Not in the vague, inspirational sense of personal growth, in the specific, measurable sense that the person you are at 25 and the person you are at 45 share a name and a social security number and almost nothing else in terms of what they actually want from life. The career path you chose because it seemed thrilling will feel like a prison by the time you're good enough at it to be trapped by the salary. The lifestyle you're sacrificing for will look different from the inside than it did from the outside. The version of success you're working toward right now was designed by a younger version of you who hadn't yet experienced the things that will matter most to you in 15 years. And yet every long-term financial plan is built on the assumption that today's preferences are permanent, that what you want now is what you'll want then. It's what Housel calls the end of history illusion, the near universal tendency to recognize how much you've changed in the past, while simultaneously assuming you're basically finished changing going forward. We look back and see transformation. We look forward and see continuity. And we build retirement accounts and investment strategies and life plans on that illusion, and then wonder why the destination feels wrong when we finally get there. And then there's the trap that runs even deeper than that. The sunk cost trap. The money you've already lost. The years you've already given. The decision you made 3 years ago that isn't working, but that you keep sustaining. Not because the evidence supports it, but because the amount you've already invested in it makes abandoning it feel like defeat. Housel says the sunk cost is one of the most financially and emotionally damaging concepts in human psychology, because it causes people to keep investing in failing directions, in failing businesses, in failing strategies, in failing careers, not because continuing makes sense, but because stopping requires admitting that the past was wrong, and we would rather multiply the loss than accept it. The financially wise thing, the genuinely courageous thing, is to protect the future from the past, to make the next decision based on where things are going, not on where they've already been. To stop treating past investment as a justification for future sacrifice, because the money is already gone. The only question that actually matters is, what do you do with what comes next? And this is where we arrive. The last part, the part that doesn't resolve anything neatly because the truth rarely does, but that leaves you with something more valuable than resolution. It leaves you with a question. Morgan Housel ends his book not with a checklist, not with a formula, not with the specific fund you should buy, or the exact percentage of your income you should save, or the magic number that will finally make you feel secure. He ends it with a confession. He tells you about his own life, his own financial choices, And what you discover is that the man who spent years studying how people think about money has organized his entire financial existence around a single, almost inarticulate hunger. Not for the biggest number, not for the most sophisticated strategy, not for the kind of wealth that makes other people's eyes change when they look at you. He wants the freedom to wake up in the morning and own his own day. He wants the ability to say no without consequences. He wants the silence that lives on the other side of financial security. Not the silence of having more than enough to spend, but the silence of having enough to refuse. He bought his house without leverage. Financially speaking, by pure return on capital analysis, this is probably not optimal. A reasonable argument exists that the money used to pay off the mortgage entirely would generate better returns invested elsewhere. And Husserl knows this. He made the choice anyway. Because the peace, the specific, irreplaceable peace of knowing that no bank has a claim on his home, that no financial disruption can take that particular thing from his family, is worth more to him than whatever return he might have captured with a more technically sophisticated strategy. He holds a significant portion of his net worth in cash. Money that earns almost nothing. Money that a conventional financial advisor would look at with something between concern and pity. He holds it because in a crisis, when markets drop and panic spreads, and every other investor is being forced to sell at the worst possible moment, liquidating good assets at terrible prices just to cover their exposure, he can sit still. He can hold. He can wait. He can let time do what time does. And he invests the rest not in individual stocks, not in complex derivatives, not in the kind of sophisticated instruments that signal financial seriousness. He puts it in low-cost index funds and leaves it there. Because he has seen what happens to the people who are convinced they can outsmart the market. Sometimes they can for a while. But the cost, not just in returns, but in attention, in anxiety, in the hours spent studying tickers instead of living, often exceeds whatever edge they gained. The Psychology of Money is a book about freedom. Not freedom as a destination you eventually reach when the number in your account finally crosses a certain threshold. Freedom as a daily practice. A series of choices made every single day about what you're willing to trade away and what you refuse to let be taken. The question it leaves you with is not about your portfolio. It is not about your savings rate or your asset allocation or your timeline to retirement. It is more personal than any of that. It is the question that was always supposed to precede all the other questions, the one most people never think to ask until they've already spent 20 years answering it wrong. What are you actually trying to buy? Because if the answer is a bigger number than you have now, a number that will eventually become enough, the pursuit never ends. The goalpost moves. It always moves. But if the answer is something else, if it's time, if it's autonomy, if it's the right to wake up on a Tuesday morning in March and belong entirely to yourself, then the path looks completely different. And the price you need to pay turns out to be far lower and far more accessible than anyone selling you a financial product ever wanted you to know. The most dangerous thing about money is not losing it. It has never been losing it. The most dangerous thing about money is spending your entire life accumulating it for reasons you never stop to examine, and arriving at the end of the journey with everything you were chasing and none of what you actually needed.